Football had in the NFL draft. What will next year have in store for the Vols? The one overall pick. Welcome into this edition of the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinels, Adam Sparks and John Adams. Guys, let's start with last week's draft before we project into the future and what it might mean for Josh Heupel. Tennessee with 3 players selected. Interestingly, nobody picked on day 1. Nobody picked on day 2. Jaylen Wright, the running back, goes in round 4 to the Dolphins. Joe Milton and Kamal Hadden, each 6th-round picks. Milton to the Patriots, Hadden to the Chiefs. Adam, overall, what would you say that this draft class says about Josh Heupel's program?
Well, it was a lot draft, that's for sure. Just 3 guys picked. A whole lot of undrafted free agents, like 8, 9 guys, for what that matters. I think a couple of those guys will actually make teams. But this was light. In the first 2 years under Heupel, they had 5 guys each year go in the draft. Last year, they had a first rounder and 4 third rounders. So that was a pretty solid showing. This was a step back. I mean, it points to a few things. There were guys that would have gone in the draft this year had they not had a COVID year, extra year of eligibility. And so a lot of those guys are coming back. So, for example, like an Omar Norman Lott, had he gone into the draft this year, I think he would have gotten picked, probably in the late rounds, but he would have gotten picked. If Brew McCoy had not been injured last year, he would have been picked in this draft. You have some offensive linemen, Cooper Mays, maybe, Javonte Spraggins, John Campbell, a lot of the guys that will have a chance of getting drafted probably in the late rounds next year would have been in this one. So I don't think it's necessarily a panic or anything. I do think it points a lot to next season because you're going to have sort of a cluster of all those guys next season. It sort of ramps up everything to be ready for Tennessee to be ready to make a playoff run next year, because there's a logjam of those type of guys. All those COVID guys, COVID seniors who'll be on the team next year. You could have a whole lot of guys drafted next year, mostly offensive and defensive linemen. And so while Nico is taking over as the quarterback this coming season, you've got maybe your best NFL group that's all going to be there with him, but you're only going to have those 2 pieces together for one season.
John, of these 3 guys that were picked, Jaylen Wright, Joe Milton, Kamal Hadden, asking you to put on your NFL scout hat here. Which of those 3 would you predict would have the best NFL career?
Oh, I don't think it's close. I'd pick Jaylen Wright. I know running backs are devalued now, so when you look at where he was drafted, that's not necessarily an indictment of his ability. It's more telling about the way the game has evolved and how running backs just don't matter as much in the NFL. They don't really matter as much in college either. So it's not a high priority position. So I think he showed his talent. I expect him to last in the NFL.
There is a path for all 3 of these guys to do something in the NFL, but it's more narrow for the other 2 guys. Jaylen Wright is a speed guy. I think he's going to have some wow type moments in games. I think he's going to have a good career, at least for running back, like John said. And in that offense, I think he fits real well. Kamal Hadden, it depends on how they use him. I think Kamal Hadden is a guy that could maybe be a nickel, maybe a guy that if you play a lot of zone, I have no idea what the Chiefs do in terms of their coverage, but he could be a guy that if you fit him in exactly the right spot of what his skill set matches, he can have a reasonable NFL career. If you put him out on an island as a man corner, he's going to be exposed. He won't be in the league long. Joe Milton is an interesting one because the less you see of Joe, probably the longer his career could be. You think, I mean that.
He needs to not play to last. Is that
what a compliment, Adam?
Think about what the situation he's in. He goes to the Patriots. They get Drake May with a number 3 pick. So that's their guy. That's their franchise quarterback. So Joe is going to be, maybe they clean house with those other quarterbacks and he's a 2, but I figure he's going to be a 3. He'll be a 3 and they'll keep one of those other veterans that they have. And so he's not playing. He probably won't play at all this year. Who knows if he'll play in the second year. You could see somewhere down the line, especially if the Patriots aren't very good, or if they're at least not as good as they have been, that he gets a chance. He gets like a game and a half, maybe he gets to it where he's a backup, or late in the season he goes from 3 to 1 because of injuries, and he finishes a game. In a short snippet, Joe Milton can really open some eyes of some people, but less is more. You think about the Orange Bowl that we saw. He said, hey, look at Joe Milton. If he can just do that like 12 more times, think about what kind of player he's going to be. Joe Milton could easily be the guy that fools some GM into taking him somewhere. I don't think he's ever going to be the guy with the Patriots at all. But, you know, you remember back, this used to happen a lot more, maybe 10, 20 years ago in the NFL, where like a Scott Mitchell or one of those guys would like have 3 games at the end of a season as a backup. He'd say, wow, look at this guy. And then he'd suddenly get a chance somewhere else. That's the path for Joe Milton to stay in the league, because if he gets a long period of time of chances, then people will give up on him.
I'm trying to envision this conversation in the war room about whether to draft Joe Milton or not. And they come to the conclusion, you know what? As long as we don't need to play him, he could be really valuable.
Well, what I'm thinking, Blake, is when Adam was giving this sterling projection for Joe Milton in the NFL, I'm thinking, well, he just kind of needs to hide over there on the sidelines. If they can't see him, they can't cut him. Just kind of, stay very low key. I know he's a big guy and he's hard to overlook, but hide in a broom closet or something. Just don't let them know you're around, and maybe you'll be the third quarterback.
Yeah, the old George Costanza approach of he works at a place and no one really knows he works there, and just keeps drawing a page.
Hey, not that it matters much, but Joe Milton would probably be like the best scout team quarterback in NFL history. Think about if you go at the beginning of the week and say, hey, do we have anybody that looks and throws like Josh Allen? Yeah, actually we do. We got this athletic guy that can, throw it through a brick wall. Yeah, we've got that guy over on the scout team. So he will have some value for a little while. That's for sure.
All right. After this ringing endorsement of Joe Milton's NFL prospects, I'm sure we can expect him to have a Hall of Fame career. But moving on to next year, Adam, you had a breakdown in Knox News recently looking at Tennessee's players who could be picked in next year's draft. And as I was reading through the list, it's like, okay, these look like a bunch of day 3 type of guys, which you need those, need those in your program, obviously, but it helps to have some round 1, round 2, round 3 type of talents. James Pierce would seem to be where that conversation starts, right? I mean, how high end is his NFL draft potential, do you think?
I've seen him as the number 1 overall pick next year. In mock drafts, I've seen him, our company, USA Today, had him the number 3 overall pick. I've seen a lot of mock drafts that have him as definitely the number 1 overall defensive player in next year's draft. Now, for Tennessee fans that hear this, don't think that's like the consensus. That's also a year away. So if James Pierce is a top 5 pick next year, great. Those mock drafts were correct. But it's just as easy to go from like the top 5 guy to then like middle of the first round. I would expect James Pierce will be a first round pick next year, but a lot can happen that can move him, into the top 5 or out of the top 20. He plays a position that's of extremely high value as a pass rusher. I think what he showed, especially late last season, and if you watch the Citrus Bowl, you saw this, is that it's just not a tall, thin speed guy. He's a guy that has deceptive power in his upper body. He can take an offensive tackle and throw him in a way that you wouldn't think he could. He's a guy like in the Citrus Bowl that has shown an ability to drop into coverage. He had a pick 6 in that game. So he's sort of the every down type edge rusher that every NFL team is looking for. So if he can play a full season like he did in a lot of spots this past year, he'll be a top 10 pick. Now, after him, Blake, you mentioned the story that I wrote. I had 10 other guys, I think, listed that all have a chance of getting drafted if this, that, and the other happens. I would expect the over-under right now is probably like 5.5. And most of the guys would be late round picks. Like I mentioned, Omar Norman Lott, if he can have a good year this year, he can get drafted next year. Brew McCoy, maybe. Cooper Mays, maybe. Javonte Spraggins, maybe. John Campbell, maybe. A lot of those other defensive linemen, Omari Thomas, Bryson Eason. But like a lot of those linemen, like half of those linemen are going to have a chance by the time you get to next year because they're gonna rise or fall. I do think it's interesting, and I know we'll get to this, is that we're not talking a lot about offensive skill players in that list. A lot of O linemen, a lot of D linemen. And you think about the drafts under Josh Heupel, the first round pick next year is going to be James Pierce, an edge rusher. Who have been the most successful draft picks under Josh Heupel? It was Alontae Taylor, 3 years ago at the corner. It was Darnell Wright, an offensive tackle. It was Byron Young, who was almost a defensive rookie of the year, another edge rusher. So D lineman and a corner and an offensive tackle, none of those are offensive skill guys, which in college is what this offense is known for. Quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers. And those guys actually get harmed in the pre-draft analysis more than they're helped. They're harmed by the offense that they're in. I'm not saying that's fair. No, don't shoot the messenger, but Hendon Hooker dropped from maybe first round to third round because there was knocks on him about running Josh Heupel's offense. Jaylen Wright was supposed to be maybe a second round pick, but he drops to the fourth. And a lot of what you hear after the draft is that, well, he didn't play against a full box. Like they spread the offense out, so he's not going against a full tackle box. Jalen Hyatt was the Biletnikoff winner, was projected by a lot of people early on as a mid to late round pick. He drops to the third round because they say, well, the play calls got him open. And so right now, a lot of the draft success and the NFL success that Tennessee is having in a short term under Josh Heupel is D linemen under Rodney Garner, some offensive linemen, and certainly pass rushers, but not skill guys.
Yeah, and it's interesting, sort of what the long-term outlook is with that approach. Because on the one hand, I can argue that Tennessee going 9-4, winning the Citrus Bowl, and having just 3 guys selected in the draft. Now, as we talked about, James Pierce will come next year, and there's other NFL guys on this roster, but you sort of judge it by how many guys are picked in the following year's draft. And Tennessee just has the 3 guys. So to go 9-4 with that collection of guys is obviously a testament of Josh Heupel's system, of his coaching ability, the staffs, the whole bit. And yet, on the other hand, you look at the programs that led the way for draft picks this year. Michigan, 13 players selected in the draft. They won the national championship. Texas, 11 players drafted. They were in the college football playoff semifinal. Alabama, 10 players drafted. College football playoff semifinal. Washington, 10 players drafted. College football playoff runner-up. I mean, like I said, it's great coaching to be able to go 9-4 with 3 guys then being drafted. But if you want to get to the highest ceiling in college football, being the national championship, you got to have more than 3 players drafted in the spring. I think back to Mike Leach sometimes had some of this narrative working against his players in the draft of, well, they're scheme guys, and probably to a certain extent, Art Briles, his scheme had that working against some of his guys at Baylor, and the air raid and the Briles scheme that uplifted the programs on the field that those coaches had, helped them punch above their weight class generally, but players weren't often rewarded in the draft. So what do you guys see being as the outlook here? John, let's start with you. Sort of, do you think this limits the ceiling of Tennessee at all? The fact that at least in the early going here, we see that it's maybe just going to be a handful of players drafted from Josh Heupel's program every year, whereas top end schools like Michigan and others have double digits.
Yeah, maybe Josh Heupel has the right system, though. Go back to 22 when the Vols were in the running for the college football playoff, had that awful game against South Carolina. Then Hendon Hooker was hurt, but it finished 11. They finished 11-2. It's not Josh Heupel's job to send the most guys to the NFL draft. So maybe if he has a system, he can win with slightly lesser players. But we're talking about offense. So maybe it's a good sign that he's getting high-rated players on defense. It's not his fault if the NFL devalues his players because of a system. Now, maybe it would help that a healthy Hendon Hooker becomes a productive NFL quarterback. Maybe then people will say, well, he was in that system. He did great in it. Tennessee led the nation in scoring. So I think it's more crucial maybe that Tennessee has great players on defense and more high NFL draft picks on defense. I think back to the Steve Spurrier era. He had players, certainly had quarterbacks who weren't really great in the NFL that were great in college, but he had a lot of terrific defensive players who were drafted high and performed well in the NFL. So maybe this could all work out. But Adam pointing out that James Pierce could be the number one pick overall, even, or the number one defensive pick. I think you got to, when you look at those teams that win championships, they usually have a high number of NFL draft picks. So maybe Tennessee, if it can just keep building like that and produce those kind of players, it can do better. I just don't know about the offense. I mean, if you can lead the nation in scoring, as Tennessee did in 22, that to me should be enough. I mean, even if those guys aren't considered superstars by NFL standards, that team put a lot of points up on the board against Alabama, and Alabama had some future first rounders on that defense. Yet Tennessee's just riddling it on the field. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't think the narrative with Josh Heupel's offense in terms of skill guys getting drafted high in the NFL, I don't think that narrative is going to change until one of his NFL players from Tennessee changes it. Like John mentioned, Hendon Hooker has been injured, so he hasn't played in the NFL yet. If he were to on the NFL, that probably would help Nico out in the draft in a couple years from now. Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman both were drafted in the third round. They played some, but they haven't set the league on fire. So it's not like you can look at either one of those guys and say they were underdrafted. So when Brew McCoy comes out next year, even if he's really productive, do scouts say, well, that big physical wideout they had before Cedric Tillman was an all-SEC 1,000-yard pass catcher. And, in the NFL, he's been just okay with the Browns. So I think until the narrative has changed in the NFL, I think Josh Heupel's guys are going to be fighting that to some extent, just the skill players. Also, though, I don't know if Tennessee fans even care. I've always gotten the sense that Tennessee fans will follow a certain player to an NFL team. Obviously, the classic example is, all the brand new Colts fans when Peyton gets drafted there, and then some of them Broncos fans later. But I've never sensed a really, really strong connection with Tennessee Vols fans in the NFL. So I think to some extent, if Josh Heupel's getting the Vols to the playoff and then the draft comes in April and guys are undervalued and underdrafted, I think Vols fans will be fine saying, we're the victim of bad analysis and our guys should be drafted higher, but oh well, we're a playoff team. And I think UT fans are sort of fine with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to, they may not care that much about the draft. I guess my point would be you're not going to win a national championship with 5 guys being drafted, with 4 guys being drafted. That's a fact. They're not winning a national championship with 4 or 5 guys being drafted. You look back off that 2022 team, and they had 5 players drafted that year, all within the first 3 rounds. And to me, that's sort of the line of demarcation. You need guys that are drafted. If you want to win a national championship or be in the hunt for that, you need guys that are going in rounds 1, 2, or 3. I think there is a drop off, as you get to day 3 in the draft. And that year, even if there may be some NFL skepticism in the scheme, they still had 4 offensive guys go within the first 3 rounds of the draft, being Darnell Wright, a first rounder, Hendon Hooker, Jalen Hyatt, Cedric Tillman going in the 3rd round. That team, I think, was hamstrung by not having more NFL talent on defense. And so I think it's the pairing of Josh Heupel's offensive scheme and some guys that, they might be punished a smidge by NFL evaluators. But if you have a season like a Jalen Hyatt, I still think you're going within the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft. But it's pairing that scheme and that type of offensive talent with some NFL dudes on defense. And I don't think that Tennessee's had the last couple seasons NFL dudes on defense. They've had a couple of them. I mean, they had Byron Young, obviously, was an NFL dude on defense and was a 3rd-round draft pick. James Pierce is an NFL guy on defense. But I think to win national championships, you got to have the type of NFL-level talent that Georgia's sent to the draft the last few years. Michigan just sent to the draft. I think that's sort of what's missing is pairing the scheme and the production and some NFL guys on the offensive side with having a greater abundance of NFL caliber players on defense.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 ways to do that. You've got to recruit 5-star players and high 4-star players out of high school. 5-star players end up in the NFL. They just do. Even if they're disappointments in college, they end up in the NFL, usually in the high rounds, because that is an evaluation of just an elite athletic specimen. So you have to recruit 5 stars and high 4 stars. They've gotten those more so in the edge rushers than anywhere. And, we mentioned James Pierce is the first one coming up. They've got some others behind him that are at least in that conversation. And then the other way that you do it is through the transfer portal. You can't get like 2nd tier or 3rd tier portal players sort of just plug and play and they're good enough. You've got to get the elite out of the portal. And I mean, like if you look at the guys that I listed for next year's draft, 11 players that I think at least have a path to getting drafted next year. They won't all get drafted, but 11 guys that have a possibility. 6 of them are high school guys that Tennessee brought here. 5 of them are transfers. So you can see, and I think that divide will probably hold up over the long term. It's sort of half and half of guys that you recruited and developed like a James Pierce, but then other guys you just went in the portal and just, filled a spot. And then that's an Omar Norman Lott. That's a Brew McCoy. That's a John Campbell. Lance Hurd, who was a 5-star, their left tackle right now. He can go in the draft in a couple years. He came out of LSU, but he was a 5-star guy that got out of the portal. So you've got to go win those battles in the portal to get the absolute elite players in there. They've done that a little, but they haven't done that enough to say that these are going to be high round guys.
So I wonder if the system, let's talk about offense. The system, I wouldn't think it discourages wide receivers and running backs from coming to Tennessee. I mean, to me, if you're a wide out or you're a running back, not just high school recruits, but transfer portal guys, it seems like you would want to play in this offense where everybody has a potential to put up really big numbers. We've seen that not just here, but when Heupel was a coach at UCF, a lot of guys had really good stats. So, I mean, do you think anybody's in the recruiting process saying, on offense, do you think somebody's saying, well, I don't know if I ought to go there? It's kind of a system. maybe that wouldn't be the best thing for me and looking ahead to an NFL career. I can't imagine that.
It's funny is that depending on when you look at their production, you can make the case that Josh Heupel's system gets the most out of wide receivers. And then you can also make the argument that because he gets the most out of wide receivers in college, that devalues them in the NFL. Like, think of the ones that we've talked about have been drafted. Velus Jones Jr. was a good returner at USC, but he wasn't a really good wide receiver. He comes over to Tennessee. He's a third-round pick, an all-SEC receiver, a slot receiver. Jaylen Wright was a guy that had barely caught any balls under Jeremy Pruitt's system. Josh Heupel develops him. He's a Biletnikoff winner. Cedric Tillman was a disappointment when Josh Heupel got here. He was a big, strong, fast guy that had not done anything in his career, and he becomes a 1,000-yard receiver. All three of those guys, you can argue, benefited from Josh Heupel's system because all three of those guys ended up being disappointments as receivers early in their career, and they ended up being third-round picks. So Josh Heupel got them to the third round. But their production suggests they should have been higher in the third round. So he can kind of help you or hurt you. Like, he can get you into the NFL, but in the way that he gets you to the NFL, it's probably gonna devalue you a little bit within which round you're picked in.
Do you think excuse me, but do you think recruits look that deeply into it and think that much about it?
Only if they're told to, I think. Also, I think recruits say, well, that's not me. I mean, I'm the elite player in college that's also the elite player in the NFL. So it really depends on like how intricate that a player and their advisor or their family want to look into it. But yeah, you're right, John. I think if Josh Heupel sits down in a living room and says, hey, look at these guys. That guy's Biletnikoff. These guys were all picked in the early rounds of the draft. It's a 1,000-yard receiver. I get a receiver. There's not much to him. I turn him into a star, and that's what I'll do for you. If it goes to the next level, you can have opposing coaches say, yeah, but what have they done in the NFL? And a lot of times, players are looking 6 months down the road. They're not looking 5 or 6 years down the road. So it really depends on, I guess, how intricately the kid wants to look into it. Also, we're missing the obvious point. How much are you going to pay me in NIL money? And sometimes if you're going to flip a coin, if there's an extra comma in one of the numbers, you tend to go that way.
Yeah, I think NIL remains a selling point. I do think this offense remains a selling point. And I think what you guys have mentioned, both of you, is like, if someone from this system breaks through in the NFL in the next couple of years, all of this sort of gets, tamped down a little bit in these whispers of, well, is it a system? Are these system guys or what? If a Jaylen Wright breaks through or, some receiver in years to come breaks through, I think that quiets that down. Or if Jaylen Wright, gets off to a nice start in his NFL career as a running back. I think that, Adam, you were talking about this system helps showcase guys. It helps turn guys that are, maybe fringe NFL prospects into mid-round NFL prospects. And once one of these guys breaks through, maybe that quiets some questions. I still think the offensive system is the selling point. I go back to, if you want to win national championships, you have to get more NFL talent on defense, because there's no scheme detriment to you there. I mean, the reason Tennessee is not having more guys drafted on defense has nothing to do with scheme. They haven't had the guys the past couple of years that NFL teams want. They've had a couple of guys, including Byron Young, and as we talked about, a lot of teams will want James Pierce, but they haven't had the abundance of guys that teams like a Georgia, like an Alabama, like a Texas have had.
Well, and I'll point to what I said earlier. If you're talking about, put NFL aside, if you're just talking about how this affects Tennessee's season, this coming season and the following season, those guys that are going to get drafted, like they're out of eligibility after this year. Like the 11 guys that I'm talking about, I think 9 or 10 of them are out of eligibility. They're gone. That's most of your D line and practically all of your O line. And so it really puts a premium on this season because you have an NFL defensive line this year. You have an NFL offensive line this year. That may be 6th round picks and not 2nd round picks, but there's NFL caliber talent on both of those lines, which means, you have a shot to make the playoff with that talent because it drops off immensely the next year, and you're going to be swimming in the portal as much as any team is to replenish those two groups.
All right, all the coverage of Tennessee in the NFL draft can be found over at knoxnews.com. Also, check out Adam's story breaking down the list of players who could be picked next year. Of course, that's headlined by James Pierce, but many, many others as well that, as Adam talked about there, could be late round picks, and Tennessee will be counting on them very heavily this season. That's how it relates to this year, is if Tennessee's going to make the college football playoff, the inaugural 12-team playoff, it needs high-end production from these veterans we're talking about that could hear their names called next spring. All right, we'll be back with you very soon. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.